Well, hello everyone. This is Mark Tinsley, and you're joining us on Clean Slate, where we talk about the real issues of the church with real people through real talk. And today we're going to be talking about Christianity and culture. Now, when we talk about this issue, the question is, how much do we engage or how much do we disengage with culture? You know, there's a spectrum here, and on the one end of the spectrum, there's complete disengagement. You might call it isolation, where Christians say, I'm not going to be part of culture at all. And we see this in sectarianism and in cults and things of that nature. On the other end of the spectrum, we see complete embracing of culture, where maybe there's not really that much of a discernible difference between the Christian and the non-Christian in culture. Well, obviously, as people of faith, we rarely want to be in the extremes, and so we want to find that balance. How do we as Christians engage with culture? Where do we engage? Where do we disengage? Well, to help us answer that question tonight, we're going to be talking to Dr. Karen Swallow Prior, an author and professor. Dr. Prior has written so many books and articles. Some of her books include Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, Booked, Literature in the Soul of Me, and her most recent publication on reading well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. Now, Karen has also written for Christianity Today, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Gospel Coalition, Breakpoint, Think Christian, Comment, Relevant, and Books and Culture. Karen is a research fellow with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, a senior fellow with Liberty University's Center for Apologetics and Cultural Engagement, and a member of the Faith Advisory Council of the Humane Society of the United States. Folks, we are blessed to have Karen with us this evening. And Karen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Well, folks, as you can probably tell by the audio, Karen is joining us via phone tonight. She couldn't be in the studio, but we're blessed to have her on the phone with us tonight. And Karen, we start off our first segment of Clean Slate is always the gut. What the guest's gut reaction is to whatever the topic is at hand. And today it's Christianity and culture. What is your gut reaction?
Well, my gut reaction when I hear that phrase, Christians and culture, or the relationship of Christians and culture, is to think that it's a lot like Christians or Christianity and the air. Because culture, as long as we're alive, as long as we're human, is entirely inescapable. It's part of being human, and we can't escape from it or deny it or resist it any more than we can resist breathing. So to me, the relationship between Christianity and culture is like the relationship between us and the air.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. It's just part of who we are. How would you, define culture? I mean, if you had to define it, what would you say it is?
Well, I think there are sort of textbook or dictionary definitions, which I didn't bother to look up, but they go something along the lines of, a people group's religion, art, tools, technology, all of the things that they share in common that cultivate. I mean, it's an interesting, culture cultivates, that cultivates their religion, their social outlook, their community, all the things that make a people group, and so that includes culture sort of large, like we could say American culture. It includes culture that's much smaller, like online culture or gaming culture. There are lots of different big cultures and small cultures, and I think one of the most important things for Christians to remember about culture is that clearly culture is part of God's plan for humankind, because if he wanted, we know as believers that there will be a new heaven and a new earth where the only culture that we have is the one, in God's perfect eternal presence. But he, rather than just creating humanity and having us skip over this earthly, human, physical temporary existence, which he could have. He could have designed it that way, but he put us here on this earth where, we are fallen and where we are bound by time and our mortality, and we're in culture. So culture was part of God's plan. He wanted us to be here in this fallen but still filled with blessings earthly realm, and so I think there's something here for us to learn, to grapple with, to grow, to cultivate, to steward, and I think that's it's challenging, but I think it's exciting. So I have a positive kind of embrace of the idea of culture, even as I recognize that there are challenges and pitfalls for us as well, and I'm sure that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great segue into our first question, because culture's here. It is a part of it's part of who we are as Christians. I mean, we're in a culture, and it's certainly a part of the people we're trying to reach. And so along that lines, I've been a pastor for quite a few years now, as we were talking about before the show, and also an Army chaplain. And as I've counseled soldiers, as I've counseled people in the church, I've found that there's a lot of misconceptions around this idea of Christians and how we interact with culture. In other words, there are a lot of misconceptions about how much and how we are to assimilate into our culture. So my question to you is, what are some of the principal misconceptions, misunderstandings, problems, if you will, that you've encountered in your study of this subject?
Well, I think that those problems and challenges come from two different directions, and you really alluded to those in your introduction. You talked about how, on the one hand, Christians can tend to want to separate or isolate themselves from culture, and on the other, we can be completely indistinguishable from the culture. So if we start from maybe the perspective of those who are anxious and think that culture is something we're supposed to stay away from or avoid or isolate ourselves from, or who worry about Christians in our context in 21st century America being too assimilated into the culture, I think, well, if we step back, and again, remembering that God put us here on this earth and has something here for us to do as we steward and cultivate it, and our souls and other people's and relationships with other people, if some of my more conservative or fundamentalist friends might say things about how we American Christians look too much like the surrounding culture, and I think, well, if you go around the world and see Christians in different parts of the world, if you go to India and talk to Christians there, those Christians are going to look like their fellows in Indian culture. If you go to China and talk to Christians, those Christians will look a lot like their surrounding culture, and so do we as Americans. So, I mean, Christians are part of cultures around the world and throughout history, and so in one sense, there's really no way to avoid us kind of looking like and acting like the culture that we're in when we compare it to other cultures. On the other hand, there are aspects of every culture that we inherit and that we need to think critically about and challenge as Christians in this world. And so it's really kind of there's a tension there, I think, in terms of navigating both of those extremes and not ending up in either one of them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the things that I think about when I think about this topic of Christianity culture is that, sometimes there's this idea, and I call it in my notes, modern Gnosticism, where we think that anything that has to do with culture, if it's a secular culture, anything whatsoever, it has to be inherently bad. Like the Gnostics felt that anything that was physical had to be inherently bad. But I think what you're saying, and what I believe, is that culture isn't inherently bad. Culture is a part of who we are. Like you said, you go to different cultures, Christians are going to look different because they're from different people groups. They have different environments that they've grown up in, ways that they interact with one another, social relationships and things like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, and even, languages and traditions and
Right.
customs that are part of the culture. Of course, some of them clearly go against Christianity, but so many of them are just cultural, and they're more or less neutral, like a language. A language is just part of a culture, and yet different languages make us think differently, think about the world differently, and are part of our culture, but part of our differences as well.
That's a great point. And there's just differences that we can't help but be different with as we move from one culture to another.
And even if we look throughout church history, I mean, there's a great book called Christ and Culture by Richard Niebuhr. It's a classic book that has studied the entire history of the church and its different stances throughout culture, like different, and he gives these categories of Christ against culture, Christ with culture, Christ in culture. And if we have a little bit of perspective, we can see that there are different denominations and faith traditions that approach this question differently, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. But the beauty is that we can learn from them. We can learn from the different approaches and try to figure out which one is most biblically faithful and also suited to our times, because obviously there are different cultures that are more friendly toward the Christian faith and others that are more hostile, and those different environments create different demands for believers in those times and places.
Right, and so it requires us to be adaptive. I read a book recently on this issue about being adaptive in your culture. It's called Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. I don't know if you've run into that book yet.
But that's a great term.
Yeah, when it talks about the metaphor is the Lewis and Clark expedition, and how when they hit the Front Range and topped the Front Range, they were expecting to find that waterway to the west, but what they found were more mountains. So they had to adapt to the different environment. And as Christians in culture, I think that's so key for us to be able to adapt.
Yeah, that's a great term to use, and it changes not only from culture to culture, but even from decade to decade. I mean, I've lived long enough now where I can see how the relationship between Christians and cultures and our culture has changed in one area or another, and is continuing to change, and how things are just different, and we have to adapt in how we respond to those issues and to the people affected by those issues, and yet at the same time, try to be faithful to the Bible and to our beliefs, and it's a challenge.
Absolutely. So let's go to the next question then. The genesis of these misconceptions. I mean, why do these kinds of misconceptions even exist?
Those go all the way back in church history. Well, actually, we can even go back to the Old Testament, to oftentimes the culture of the city, which is kind of the contrast to that first environment that we found ourselves in, the Garden of Eden, is attributed to Cain. That after Cain killed Abel and ran off, Cain is said in the Bible to be the originator of the cities and technology, and so we can see that kind of culture, which I think, if we think of that as in contrast to sort of an unfallen nature and paradise that we have in the Garden of Eden, is rooted in sin, and so if it is, then that means it's we're constantly going to be challenged and having to navigate it. And then we skip ahead into the early church age, and one of the early church fathers, Tertullian, is famous. Well, he's famous for a few things, but one of the things he's famous for is asking the question, what has what has Jerusalem to do with Athens? And he's asking really, like, what does the Judeo-Christian religious worldview have to do with kind of the pagan Greek philosophy of the culture that the early church found itself in? And so by asking that, he was actually asking that question, what does one have to do with the other? And the church has been grappling with that question ever since. And I think we can look throughout the New Testament throughout church history, and we can see lots of different approaches to that really important question. And in one person, I think we can see all of the tensions, and that person is St. Augustine, who, if you're familiar with the story, you know that he was very learned, well-schooled in Greek rhetoric and philosophy and law, and had a conversion to Christianity later in his adult life. And so when he started writing about his spiritual autobiography, and then later a work I'm pretty familiar with on Christian teaching, he actually wrestles, without even realizing it sometimes, because he questions that classical learning, and in particular rhetoric or eloquence, that he studied before he was a Christian. Yet at the same time, even when he's questioning it and denouncing it, he's still using those skills of rhetoric. He's still speaking eloquently and using the logic that he learned. And so we can see in one of the most, early church fathers who's been so influential, his own struggle with that relationship, and he's actually kind of inconsistent, which is encouraging because we all are. And
Amen.
So,
that's right.
All through church history, this has been the question. Well,
this is why I had you as a guest on the show tonight, because you brought up Gustin, and that's awesome. And you used him as an example, and this is why you're on the show tonight. And thank you. That is a wonderful object lesson of what we're talking about here. And you're right. The fact that he struggled with it is encouraging to the rest of us fallen believers out here that are trying to do the same thing. How much do you think lack of biblical knowledge of the average Christian, as it were, plays into this whole inability or wrestling with how to engage with culture?
That's a good question. I think we do lack biblical knowledge, and I think we also, even when we have knowledge of verses and Bible stories, we lack a sense of the entire narrative and how it all fits together. We'll often hear, we'll hear skeptics and unbelievers do this, but I hear Christians do it too. There's a real confusion, for example, about how, why do we adhere to some verses in the Old Testament and not others? And people will pull things sort of out of context and say, well, how come we don't obey this Old Testament command, but we say this one is important? And there's actually answers to that, because the New Testament, it addresses some of those things and says some of those things are no longer valid, and some of them have been fulfilled, and some still are principles that are woven throughout the narrative. And so, I am an English professor, and so I do tend to read things in terms of their in a literary sense, because the Bible is a book, and in some ways, even though it's the inspired Word of God, and every it's true with a capital T, it also is in some ways like a book, in the sense that something that is stated at the beginning, we reach a fuller understanding of what that means when we get to the end, and so something can, just like if we read a novel. Something that a character says or does at the beginning doesn't necessarily represent where that character or theme lands by the end of the book. And so I think that it's not just knowing things that are in the Bible, but knowing how one part of the Bible fits with other parts, and then what that means in whole for our understanding of how we live in the world.
Absolutely. Taking things in context, knowing how the full range and how things weave together in Scripture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And there are a lot of preachers that have a problem with that as well. Get up in pulpits. Yeah, well, it is. Yeah, because you have to look at the whole of Scripture and how it all weaves together. And depending on whether your covenant theology or how you approach the Bible, it does affect how you interpret it. But well, that's all great. I love your input, and again, I love how you brought Gustin into the discussion. But so on Clean Slate, we are about not just pointing out the problems. We want to also come up with some solutions. So how do we correct these misconceptions? what can Christians do to correct these misconceptions and thereby effectively interact with culture? I mean, what do we do? How do we do this, practically speaking?
Yeah, wow. If I could really answer that question well, I think we'd solve
There you go.
most of the problems in the church and the world today.
There you go.
But,
there you go.
I think it has more to do with our own posture and our own character, because we are certainly there's not a formula for addressing every situation. Every movie, every policy that comes up for a vote. I mean, there are some things that are clearly black and white and right or wrong. But there are other things like, films that we might watch that might be a stumbling block for me, but can be edifying for someone who's, who sees different things in films. And so, or different music or so forth. These are all the things that are most common in surrounding us in day-to-day culture. And so I think that we need to have a character of, on the one hand, humility, to want to, and humility, I think, is want to have humility means that we understand we have to learn things. We have things to learn from one another and
right.
from the Bible, and that we actually believe in truth with a capital T, but recognize that we don't necessarily have a handle on it every time. And so to have that posture of humility at the same time that we do believe that there is a right way and a wrong way, but we're just figuring out maybe how to get there, and not only to get to the right destination, but to do it in the right way. So if right is a destination, we need to not, break the speed limit to get there, not trespass on other people's property to get there. So there are right goals and destinations, but also right ways of doing things. And I think sometimes Christians think it's either one or the other, like right at any cost, or it doesn't really matter as long as I'm a nice person. Well, no, it's, the Bible talks about speaking the truth in love.
Right.
Well, that's an example of doing the right thing in the right way. And that requires humility. It also requires, diligence. The Bible talks about all of these virtues that I'm mentioning, and a sincere seeking heart. And so that requires, seeking counsel, looking to wise examples and role models like Gustin. I mean, it doesn't even have to be Gustin. It can just be, an older man or woman in the church that we know is a good example for us. So again, I think not looking for a formula, but knowing that there is a right way and a wrong way, and being humble as we seek to get there the right way.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think your last point there about seeking out the wisdom of those around us who've kind of gone before us, kind of a Hebrews 11 approach, looking at that great cloud of witnesses. In my life, it's my grandfather on my mom's side. He just was such a wise man and lived his life virtuously and as a man of God and as a man after God's own heart. And so I can look to him as how did he engage culture? I think that's a great point. And I think also I would like to point out that this idea of culture and engaging the culture, I mean, it's biblical. I mean, the Great Commission says, go and make disciples, right? I mean, go to the world. I mean, Acts 1:8, you go out to Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the rest of the world. I mean, we're supposed to be out there. And I also think about, one time somebody asked me, how can you be a conservative evangelical Christian and be an army chaplain where you're working in a pluralist environment? And my answer was, well, if I'm not there, who's going to be there?
Right.
If I'm not there as a voice of reason and truth and love, big T truth, like you said, then what are the soldiers going to get? So as I think about this Christianity and culture, I think we need to be out there with our love, our truth, our grace, our mercy, our reason, in order to affect positive change. I mean,
right.
What do you think about that?
Exactly. Yeah, and we need to really make sure that we are nourishing the Holy Spirit in us, so that, because the Holy Spirit is a teacher and a guide, and we need to be sure that our consciences are ready to be pricked when we're, perhaps being unequally yoked to
Right.
whether it's in our friendships or in our entertainment. We can be attentive to that, but at the same time, we can be like Christ and take all of these things under our submission, so that they we can be in the world but not of the world. We can walk through it like Christ and not be tainted. I mean, we're not Christ, but He's our
Yes.
model for that. He was able to be in the world and not be touched by sin.
That's right. So who better to look to for our guidance, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So you're in a room, hypothetically here, with a group of folks that are struggling with this issue of Christianity and faith. I mean, what are your top 3 bits of advice? What would you say to folks?
Well, I would say again that the world is good because because God made it good, and so we should be seeking the goodness in it more. And as we do that, developing our discernment in order to tell the difference between what's good and bad. And actually, I just want to give a shout out to an excellent book by a friend of mine, Hannah Anderson. It's called All That's Good, and it's on the lost art of discernment. And this book is exactly about this topic, about discerning what's good from what's not in our culture, and also developing our ability to discern, because as we've been talking about, it's hard. So seek what's good, develop our discernment so that we can better judge what's good, and then seek to model that good, that hunger and thirst for goodness, not only in ourselves but for those around us. Because ultimately, because we're all made in God's image, but even though we're fallen, we do have in us a desire and an ability to seek after good. And sometimes it's so easy to get dragged down by the wrong people around us. But it's also easy to be lifted up and to be led the right way by having the right people around us. And so we can seek the right people, but we can also be those people for others as we all pursue good together.
And I think that's a wonderful point, your third point about modeling it for everyone else. I'm working with a couple of folks now that one of whom authored a book called Words and Deeds. And it's all about how can the Christian's words and deeds marry up. How do we make our actions follow our words, and vice versa, our words follow our actions, and just living a life of integrity. That's the subtitle of the book. And I think I thought about that book immediately when you were talking about modeling, because that's what it's about. I mean, our life of faith is not just about saying the right things, believing the right things, being in the right places, but it's about modeling truth to the world.
And I'll just also add, because so many people seem to think that real life is one thing and the online world and social media is another, and it's not. We need to be the same people, and we can be salt and light and model goodness on social media too. And for some reason, it just seems like even Christians are susceptible to the idea that we don't have to do that, but we do. It's a mission field in itself, and so I just encourage people who are on social media to consider that. I mean, that's a huge part of our culture, and it's a place that also we can go and redeem through bringing the Spirit of Christ there as well.
Yeah, and I agree. And I appreciate all the work that you do through social media and getting the truth out and engaging culture the way you do. I mean, it's encouraging, inspires people like me to go try to do likewise. But Karen, is there anything else as a kind of a final thought or that you'd like to say to the audience?
Well, I would just say, we're all in a culture, no matter how big or small our world is or in our circle of friends. And so we are all called to engage the culture wherever we are. And so it's a challenge for all of us, but one that God designed us for. And so we can seek His help as we do it. And I would just see it. It is hard, but I would see it as an exciting challenge as well, because it's the mission He placed before us.
And how true that is. The Great Commission, the mission to be out there and do the work that God's called us to do. Well, Karen, thank you so much for being a part of our show tonight.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And folks, I want to thank all of you that are watching live right now and those who will certainly watch this in its recorded version. How do we engage with culture? I mean, it's not an easy question, as Karen has said. It's a question that requires a lot of discernment, a lot of prayer, experience. I mean, knowledge of God's word, and the list goes on and on. But it's our place. It's our job, as it were, as people of faith, to engage our culture, to find that balance between the extremes of isolation and complete embrace. And again, I hope tonight has given you some tools, perspectives that you can use in your lives of faith to find that balance for you, wherever you are and whatever your culture is, to find the balance between the extremes, to find the balance that exhibits and models truth, the truth of the gospel, to the world around you. Well, folks, that's our show for tonight, but we are going to be back again next Tuesday, March 5th at 8 p.m. We're going to be talking to Duncan Wood about contemporary Christian music. Now, Duncan's a professional musician, he's a praise team leader, and he's an author. And we're going to come together next week, and we're going to hear from Duncan Wood, and we're going to talk about the issue of contemporary Christian music in the church. You won't want to miss it. Folks, I hope you have a wonderful day. God bless you all, and we'll see you next time.